So a little bit about myself and why today I'm going to talk to you about deep tech at this deep tech conference. I am the managing partner of Roundabout Ventures, investing in pre-seed, early seed deep tech. I've been doing this as an angel up until now for a couple of years. And the reason I got into tech investing, since I'm a software engineer by background, that's been what I've been doing for the last 12 years, is because of Silicon Roundabout, a deep tech community I co-founded and still run. It's open for everybody to join, engineers and founders. And, we meet here in London and of course online. So why deep tech and why today? Because tech in general has been generating trillions of dollars of value. We all know what happened over the long haul, not just the short-term ups and downs. And this value generation has really taken us from the Silicon Revolution up until what's possibly going to be the next wave. Because again, if we ignore the short-term ups and downs, the trend is always up and to the right. And every new cycle takes us to heights that are exponentially bigger than anything that's ever been built before, from personal computing all the way to the cloud.
And so if you look at the trend in general, we can see that there are always cycles. And in these cycles, in fact, we've come full circle twice already. The first time with the explosion of technology development started really with companies we might not know, like Fairfield Semiconductors back in the 60s and 80s, venture-backed companies that powered the internet and personal computing at the hardware and real science level. Of course, we all know Apple, maybe that's a bigger brand, or Intel. And that has really helped create what then became mania back in the 90s with the dot-com crash. But then both before and after that crash, you started to see companies coming up. AWS is not really an independent company, but you could argue that effectively kickstarted the cloud revolution. And of course, all of these infrastructure players then enabled all of the checkout.com and Klarna and all of the digital mobile apps and tech-enabled apps that have come out of it. But in venture capital, what happened in both these cycles is that when the trend starts to go up, people start to flock to it looking for, let's call it easy money. You could argue, why invest anymore in disruptive technologies like the pioneers of Silicon Valley used to do, or the early investors in the 2000s when everybody was scared were doing, when today seems so easy. You take an existing business, you innovate on the business model, you put it up in the cloud, it's easy, it's cheap, and you ride the money train. But all that glisters is not gold, like Shakespeare reminds us. Because the cheaper it gets, if you think about it, the more competition you start to get. And so this stats, by the way, it was already before the crash that we're seeing today. And actually I wrote about it in early January when we're still not sure that this was going to be a clash. Effectively, the question is that the cheaper it gets, the more competition you have, and so the less efficient it gets. There is a point, a tipping point, where efficiency, instead of going up, it starts to come down, even though it gets cheaper to build new businesses with existing technologies. And it is because effectively competition increases, so you've got to spend more in marketing, you need to raise more money to fight effectively copycats. And so how many then of these companies that have been funded and have been growing out of effectively existing technologies as an infrastructure are going to be the next Amazons and Googles in 10, 20 years' times, and how many are going to be the next pet.com? If you look at the start, I mentioned one word, infrastructure. Every boom, every new cycle needs a new infrastructure. It needs actual new science, new engineering that comes at the bottom of it and powers the growth that comes afterwards. And so that is what deep tech ultimately is. That combination of new science and new engineering coming to the commercial world, building something that actually is needed commercially and that is solving large global challenges. And today we can actually see some of these companies, pioneers, starting to actually affect and solve real challenges. We're seeing, for example, in curing disease, in the biotech world, you probably know BioNTech, a German company that has helped us all be here without masks and free of fear of COVID and lockdowns. Of course, there is the global warming issue, so you've got energy, you need battery technology, you need food and sustainability improvement, and of course, lots of other challenges that we can solve. And deep technology really is the infrastructure that can help us tackle all of these challenges. And venture capital and startup building can play a huge role into doing this. Because the question I ask you is, How come somebody like, for example, First Life Fusion in the UK has managed to achieve in 10 years, more or less, and tens of millions in funding, what, for example, ITER in France has basically achieved in 20 years plus with 20 billion in funding? What do you think is the answer? It's actually, yes, it's the type of money and the type of company. So there's been an interesting research, you can read about it, coming from Harvard, about the efficiency of venture capital going into lean startups as opposed to being spent internally into large corporates R&Ds or in university-driven purely R&D. And it tends to be 3 to 4 times more efficient when capital actually helps new lean startups to create innovation as opposed to going and being spent into corporate or academic-driven purely R&D. And we're starting to see also that venture capital has helped some of the pioneers of deep tech. You know, it's still a niche, but some companies arguably have already hit unicorn status. Some of these companies, actually, I think Paragraph is going to be here today. You might know Northvolt, for example, you know, in the battery space, BioNTech I mentioned before. So venture capital and grant funding together have already managed to show that some of these companies can generate venture outcome from a money perspective and also impact when it comes to commercializing new technologies. And this is probably the crux of what I wanted to open this conference with. We're not here today to talk about deep tech, just any other tech conference you might go into. We're talking about a sector that is encompassing loads of different technologies, but all of these technologies have 2 characteristics. They have the capacity to be the infrastructure that's going to generate trillions of dollars of value, another wave that if we look at history and if we look at the scale of how big new waves become, is going to be incredibly bigger than anything we've ever seen before, just because this is the rule of the game. New cycles tend to be bigger, but also can have impact. We are seeing some of these companies achieving things that could have not been dreamt before at a speed that's never been dreamt before because of the type of innovation that they're making. And yet challenges still exist. Despite the amount of money going into VC, wanting to have more impact, the famous limited partners, basically money, you know, the investors into VC funds, wanting more impact out of their investments, the reality is probably, you know, some of you, if you're startups, you can relate to that. The market, you know, we're still a niche, you know, we're still, you know, this is still not Slash. And the problem is that as long as this is the case, we're going to continue to lag behind. Because, of course, in Europe, we have also some systematic challenges. You know, the UK decides to Brexit, and even within Europe, Amsterdam has a different quantum program than Paris. They don't really talk to each other too much, and you know there are some systemic issues. And yet, we're on the positive side. And yet, deep tech VC is growing. It's grown to a scale that's never been dreamt before in venture capital over the last 10 years. And so if the trend continues, ultimately what I want to leave you today is that it's going to be up to us. It's going to be up to us because one interesting stat is that there is right now a huge amount of dry powder, both at the source, the money that could go into venture capital funds and different types of funds or government deployment grants funds, and then money that is already been allocated into these types of funds that need to find their way into startups. And it's not been allocated just yet. So ultimately, whether we're investors, whether we are startup CEOs, whether we are founders, whether we are stakeholders, it's going to be ultimately up to us to decide what we're going to drive the capital into and what are we going to do with that capital. And I think that ultimately this is what deep tech ultimately is and what we're here today to do. We're here today because we want to connect, we want to try and make sure that that dry powder, that capital, is going to find its way into technologies that can both be the infrastructure of the next wave of technology development that we cannot even foresee today, and at the same time, solve real, impactful global challenge. I myself answered that question I started with, is deep tech. Why is deep tech, potentially the most impactful type of investments we can make, both in terms of time, building time, and money investment into? And the answer is yes. The answer to me is that we are seeing the very, very beginning of a new type of technology infrastructure that it's up to us to build and to invest into, and that could really change everybody's life in a meaningful way, not with a new social media app or an e-mobility app to drive around, but actually solving climate change challenges, solving health challenges, and solving computational and industrial challenges in a scale that's never been seen before. Thank you very much for listening. I really hope you enjoy the conference. I really thank Christina for organizing this amazing thing and all of you for coming. Well, like I said, you know, I'm an investor, so if you want to talk to me, I'm going to be around. You can find a t-shirt. And thank you very much. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.